right? So when I was researching for the rapture, right, and I already had my class mapped out, and I didn't expect to be taken down so many rabbit holes of super interesting things, and the class ended up going from like 1 hour to like multiple hours and becoming almost like a mini course. It's very in-depth because I was like, you have to know all this stuff. This is really interesting.
Yeah.
So way back in, am I going to get it right? I'm not the best with dates, but I think it was like 18 something in the 1800s. There was this dude up in upstate New York. Mm-hmm. Let me get his name, because I've got my notes here, and this will do it justice and give everyone the right stuff, because the whole word cognitive dissonance comes from the rapture doctrine. That's where it originates, and it also has to do with an alien UFO cult. Love which it. Like, it's a perfect blend of both of us, right? So let me tell you the story of what historians now call the Great Disappointment.
Okay.
This is a wild ride. So there was a man named William Miller who was a farmer from upstate New York. He wasn't a preacher or a priest or anything of that sort, but he did love his Bible. Now, in 1812, that was the year, there was a war which brought up a lot of doubts in his mind regarding his faith. So he chose to study his Bible intensely for 2 years in order to find his faith again. He particularly liked the book of Daniel. And in 1818, he realized that there was exactly 25 years left before Jesus would return. Love that for him.
Right.
In Daniel chapter 7 to 12, we have a number of symbolic visions of the future. Now, this biblical book was allegedly written by a man named Daniel, who was a Jewish exile in Babylon after the destruction of Jerusalem in the 6th century BCE. But biblical scholars these days know that this book was actually written in the 2nd century by someone who was claiming to be Daniel. So, of course, he would know what was going to happen because he'd already lived through it. So it was like, someone writing something now about COVID as if it hadn't happened yet. And then people in the future going, oh, they must have known, right? Like, he wrote it after the things and pretended it hadn't happened yet. So that's what's happened there, right? But good old William Miller, the farmer from upstate New York, did not know this. So everything that Daniel predicted that historically then came true was seen as proof of him being an accurate prophet. Prophet. Words, Hannah. I'm getting excited. All right, so William Miller is reading Daniel with a fine-tooth comb and comes up with a date prediction. Let me show you the mental gymnastics of how he got there. So in Daniel 8, verse 14, it says that the temple of the Jews will be defiled for 2,360 days. And in chapter 9, it says the Jews will have 70 weeks to return to God. William Miller latched onto the common view that the Bible sometimes has a day equaling a year. So 7 days is 7 years. So if the Jews have 70 weeks to return to God, 70 times 7 is 490 days, and a day is like a year. So 490 days to repent from building the temple. He needed to figure out when the temple was ordered to be rebuilt, and he found that answer in Ezra chapter 7, which has a letter from a Persian king dated 457. So that's 457 BC, they've got until 33 BCE, which was the year Jesus was killed, and Daniel must have predicted it. So this is like, this dude has gone on this massive like conspiracy theory deep dive into this one book of the Bible, right? Yeah. So then he's figured, okay, so they failed. So there's 2,360 years of defilement. That's how long we've got. Let's add it all up. That's 1843 CE, like the year 1843. So the world's going to end in 1843 and Jesus will return. It's all there. It's clear. It's in the Bible, right? So he chose a date. Sorry?
He cracked the code.
He cracked the code, right? He chose a date in April, which came and went. And his response was that he accidentally chose a date from the Gregorian calendar. Whoops. It actually needs to go off the Jewish calendar. So his new date was October 22nd, 1844. He managed to convince a few pastors and friends, and before you know it, the idea took off and infected as many as 1 million people in 1844. Like, that's a lot of people to find out and for this to spread through, right?
Yeah.
And these people started calling themselves the Millerites because this dude's name was William Miller. So thousands of people sold their farms, their property, everything they had in preparation for the end of the world. Like, they were just giving stuff away. They're like, we don't need this. I'm going to be saved. So I'm just going to give it away. Anyway, guess what happened? Nothing. So the impact it had on people was devastating. This is why it's called the Great Disappointment now. But the story doesn't end here. So the Millerites had multiple dates before they actually gave up, right? The prediction failure didn't end their movement. Instead, it made them split off into 30 different religious groups. two of which have become groups I know you'll have heard of. One is the Jehovah's Witness, and the other is the Seventh-day Adventist, which is to this day some of the fastest growing denominations. That is their origin story. Wow. But wait, there's more. Out of the Adventists, there was a split, and we got something called the Davidians, which became the Branch Davidians. And this was led by David Koresh, who his misinterpretation of the book of Revelation is what led to the disaster at Waco. Yeah. So that's like wild. So what do people do when they predict the end and it doesn't happen, right? What do you do when you're faced with this failure of this kind? This, like, I have this belief and now the facts right in front of me, the literal facts, are proving me wrong and my belief wrong. Mm-hmm. Well, this is where the UFO cult comes in. In the 1950s, there was a social psychologist named Leon Festinger who wrote a book inspired by the Millerites. So it's inspired by the Great Disappointment. And he called it When Prophecy Fails. He noticed, as you and all your listeners might have done, that the Millerites didn't give up and they kept on setting new dates, claiming the wrong calendar or some other small mistake that would explain the error. And then, they'd go out and share the new date with more people and in bigger and better ways. So they turned themselves into rampant missionaries when most people would expect them to dig a hole and hide away. Yeah. So he and a few co-authors decided to study this concept in a way that was separate to religion, right? So they chose a UFO cult to do so. And there was a group of people in the 50s that believed aliens were coming to collect them on a very specific date. The X-Files has a few episodes that are inspired by this as well. And this was, a really increasing popular belief in the 50s because there was this rise in science fiction. Right. So these social psychologists infiltrated a UFO cult and predicted aliens were coming on December 21st, 1954. They believed this because of a prophecy from a woman named Dorothy Martin, who was a Chicago housewife who practiced automatic writing. So this is, I guess, also feeding into just personally why giving specific predictions can be such a detrimental thing. And as someone who does a lot of psychic divination and astrology, I'm very careful, right? Because of this stuff. Mm-hmm. So they wanted to study what would happen to this group when the prophecy failed, which it inevitably did. Yeah. So the group did not roll over and admit defeat. They became more fervent in their belief, and their group then grew in size. They said that the Martians had given them more time to get more people in their group, and so they picked a new date. Basically, they became evangelistic about it. Yeah. So the social psychologists, including Leon Festinger, came up with a name for this and called it cognitive dissonance. So the psychological logic is that if you get more people to agree with you, then it dissolves the dissonance of knowing you were wrong, therefore making you right. Okay. End scene. That is my rabbit hole of, yes, fun facts with Hana of where cognitive dissonance comes from, coming from the rapture doctrine, misinterpretation, mental gymnastics, and the psychological aspect of, telling more people, and therefore you make yourself right. So I'm really careful now. Like, I have a lot of people that don't believe in witchcraft, right? When I say I'm a professional witch, I'm a professional astrologer, and they are skeptical. I'm like, cool, you're skeptical. This is what I do. You don't have to do it, right? Like it makes me almost really anal about making sure I don't convince other people, even though I believe it's right. Because I'm like, no, that puts me in that camp. I don't want to be in that camp.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that if you've ever been on like the other end of having other people trying to force you into buying into their belief system and their version of reality, it makes you really on guard for that in the way of, I recognize there's multiple realities. This is mine. Yeah. You don't get to I'm not going to impose mine on yours. You don't have to impose yours on mine. Like, let's all try and find some semblance of a common ground, but it can feel like, a really rebellious streak away from trying to force other people to fit in whatever box it is that you live in terms of like what you believe in. So, I like that story is that's a very cool story. It has like all the hallmarks of stuff that like captures my hyper focus for sure.
Psychology, UFO cults, like we got it all.
And religion too. I love like so obsessed with like the history and stuff of religion because it's become something that it never was intended to be. These are like oral traditions that got written down and all of a sudden people are believing that you have to believe what is exactly written in a book from a culture that has been and gone. Like, times have changed, and these stories are supposed to grow and evolve and reflect the challenges of whatever time they're being told in. And unfortunately, once they wrote that shit down, they shit the bed.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the stories that we have are kind of like fan fiction from ancient times, right? And then people now are taking it as absolutely literal. And it's like, no, dude, that guy really liked Jesus and wanted to write his own thing, right? Like we have so many examples of that culturally would have been kind of what we would appropriate to fan fiction, right? Imagine if, someone's, slash fan fiction ended up in years from now being like a biblical style book, like
yeah,
hilarious.